Hello there. So today, as sort of promised, we're going to take a look at IMVU's new creator tool. It's called IMVU Studio. So if you don't know about this, just drop a link. Drop a link to they've got a new forums section up where you can download the tool, but it's kind of buried in the forum a little bit, so I'll just drop this in chat. And the actual download is here. Right, so it's available for Windows 7 and above, and Mac. So Mac OS, they've got it here as 10.10 and above. So on older Mac systems it won't be compatible, which is in line with what's going on with Mac generally, because I think they are dropping 32-bit OS. So that basically means that the old, for Mac users in particular, basically, it means that the old client software, so that's the desktop client, no longer functions or won't function with the new 64-bit version of Mac OS. So IMVU have had to upgrade, and Studio is part of that. So they're going to upgrade to support the 64-bit OS, and that basically means that 32-bit is not going to be backward compatible. No, forward compatible. It's not. It can't be used on the new version of the operating system. So you have to upgrade. But that does mean. So that basically means now that IMVU for Mac users from this point on is going to look more like Next, and Studio is this, and this is what IMVU are pushing out to their creator community. So this is what we're going to be using from this point on. It's still in early stages, so they've got the rudimentary elements in place, and at the moment, hang on, do I have the, yes I do. So at the moment it's showing, whenever you open the application, it's just showing an archive. Hey Gaff, yes, finally IMVU Studio. So at the moment, it's just showing some of the products that you may have been working on. So you've got, it's broken down into a couple of sections. So drafts, those are the projects you're working on. Submitted, obviously products you've submitted. Then it'll have a peer review section. So there's the products that are going through peer review. And as we all know, peer review can take as much time as a couple of days, weeks even, depending on the item. And then obviously your publish catalog. So it's just showing this page by default at the moment. But it may be at some point in the future that we see some elements of the creator dashboard. So we might see some of the products on one side and all the creator dashboard stuff on the other. So that's your things like your sales reports. It might be tier points, your tier breakdown. What else is in the creator dashboard? Oh, and messages, creator messages that might pop through. So there's a lot of stuff that might be shown, but at the moment, obviously, it's just a breakdown of your products. And I think this is just so that, at the moment, just so that we have quick access to projects that we've worked on in the past. So we've got thumbnails for projects you are working on now aren't functional properly, I don't think. But for everything else, it seems to be okay because it's pulling those in, it seems, from Next, so the Next engine. But you've got all your current projects listed, and it's just a question of clicking on those to open them. So that replaces this, essentially, our project list. So we've got rid of, essentially they've got rid of ordered by newest to oldest. You can change the order from what I understand. So we've got sort by. And we've got last opened, last saved, product name. Whether they so it does do some really weird ordering. So I don't know quite what the last opened, last saved. Because last saved isn't exactly the same as product name. So I'm not quite sure what it's... So it must be doing that to all of the... well, on this page anyway, it's doing the same listing to all your products. But even then, some of the order, particularly for the published items, seems a bit off, because it's displaying a lot of, in this particular example, in JazzCats, it's kind of mixed and matched the order that the products are being shown in, so I'm not quite sure how it's ordering everything. But I would imagine that they'll have better sort order options and maybe even a date, so that you could search for something specifically, like, you know, if you had something in 2017 that you wanted to look at, because that would be a lot quicker than trying to, you know, go through your entire catalogue to try and find the product from 2017. Because otherwise we have to go to the product page, and that doesn't necessarily tell us any information about when the product, you know, the date the product was submitted to the catalogue. So I'm not sure what they're going to be doing from that point of view in terms of the information that's... What's that? I never noticed that before. So, you know, like with the in our inventory, we've got this little eye icon, and it gives us some basic information about the product. Just the name, product name, and author name. But what we could do is being able to search by date, or have these items listed by date. But this is, I don't know whether this is what we're going to be seeing as the first screen when we open up Studio. So we may eventually end up with some creator information on one side, creator messages, tier information. There's all sorts of stuff that could be displayed there that would be more useful than this information, I guess, because we kind of get this information when we create something. But it's just, once you've got something, if you don't have any projects, the way that we can access all of these is easier than from create mode, because obviously in create mode, as it currently is, we only have a limited list of the most recent items, and then of course you can click the open local project button, but that just lists a file explorer. And I don't, if I remember correctly, these things don't have icons. So the chicken files, the CHKN files, don't have an app associated with them that can display a thumbnail icon. So we're just looking at a plain folder icon. So with Studio, this is much more handy, because we can see at a glance what each of these projects are. At least these are the submitted projects. But how this ties into, because these are published projects, so how this ties into the way that we edit published projects right now, where we have to go to a product page and click the link that's at the bottom of the page in order to edit a project. So not sure how all of this stuff ties in to already published projects. I've not tried that yet. But what we've got so far is pretty simple. So we've got our, let's close that for now. Go back to the home screen. Oh, have we just crashed it? I think we just crashed it. That was a bit weird. It should be showing that screen that we were just looking at. Close that. Do that again. So, needless to say, it's a bit buggy. So, yes, to create a project or edit a project, you just click on one of the, mouse over one of the icons and just click on the edit button. But if you're creating a new project from scratch, obviously we've got this big create button in the corner. So click on that and it'll do this. So it's basically presenting us with essentially the same sort of product options, but we can filter them better. But we were looking at this the other day. So what it's doing is, if we're choosing clothing, it's giving us all the tops that are available for derivation, instead of just the default empty female clothing and the baby tee. So ordinarily we just have these very limited options the things that we want to derive from. And then we've got the empty derivable, obviously. So those two, so this one corresponds to this. And the baby T, in this instance, female top, that's that. But now we have access to all the, well, I don't know if it's all the products, but a library of other products that are derivable based on the category selection. It's not sure. Search derivable products, categories. Blah, blah, blah. I don't think there's any sorting, so we can't sort by the latest or newest. So we can only select categories. But within the categories, I don't think we can select the latest products. But yes, so it's cargo shorts, that's the default, that's normally in. Oops. So that's cargo shorts. So to derive, you just select your item. It gives you the details on the right. It shows you the derivation tree. So you don't necessarily need to select, depending on whether you're okay with the derivation chain, because some of these products might have quite a long, well, that one, for example, that's got a very long derivation chain. So do you want to go back up the tree to derive from the root item of the product, or you derive from the actual product that you clicked on? But it then shows you obviously the product itself, and then to derive or create your project, you click on the Derive button. So manipulating the scene, this is the 3D view obviously. So left click rotates and spins the, what's that, pitch or yaw? So that's left click, so that's tilting the camera backwards and forwards and rotating the scene. Right click pans or strafes, and then middle scroll zooms. But if you middle click, that also rotates and does what left click does. I'm not quite sure why that's duplicated. So left click, rotate. Right click, pan or strafe. Middle mouse zoom, scroll. And then middle mouse click, rotate again. So on the left, we have the components. These are basically the assets that are loaded in with the project. So we've got materials, meshes, that's quite a lot of meshes, and actions. And those obviously correspond to, let's just read from the cargo shorties. So those correspond to the tabs. And at the moment we've just got the main ones, which are materials, which are under meshes, actions. Well, so we've got, currently we have meshes and materials under the same tab in the creator tool, but in beta they've separated them out, so the materials and the meshes are now separate, which may make it easier to use. So you select the component that you want to inspect, and it lists each of the assets that are associated with that component. So we've got 6 materials, so 6 texture slots, and we select each of them in turn. Don't think we can select multiples. No, we can't. And on the right we have all the properties associated with that material. So that corresponds to all the material settings. So that is all of that. We've got our, so once you've selected your material, which you do on the left, we've then got all our properties. I don't know if they've transferred all of them. Yes, so we've got double-sided or two-sided, double-sided, self-illuminating, fog override, skin composite, Vertex Colors, oh there it is, multiplied by Vertex Colors, use blending, which is now blending mode, yes, I think so. They've changed the way opacity maps work. So we don't have use blending, because when blending mode is active or not active, it's implied. So if we have, as with the old creator mode, we have blending mode composite, or what was the other one, additive. So when those are set, it's assumed that blending mode is active. So you don't actually need use blending mode. So what they've done essentially, it looks like, is combined those two settings into this one blending mode setting. So we now have no blending, composite and additive. So no blending is essentially the same as leaving these two checkboxes unchecked, or these two options unset. And then what's overrideable? Never noticed that one before. Don't know what that one does. I can't remember what that does. Overrideable, but it's here. Oh, and there's the texture animation, and then also obviously the texture animation stuff. So we've now got, we activate that and it provides all the options. So those are the same options. So mode, number of cells, and again, there isn't an on option. It's assumed. Yes, I don't remember what overridable was for. Yeah, someone will know. Yeah, so there's no on because that's assumed when texture animation is active. And then of course we've got cell width, offset, direction, and cell start. So that's all of these. But the big one, let's see. No, I didn't do it with that. So, okay, we'll kind of leave that for now. I'll go over the big one. The big change is opacity maps. How opacity is dealt with, which we can't really see it because this has. Right, so this has an opacity map. But this might be a bit of a complicated product to do this with. Yeah, I'll look at opacity in a second. So, we've got our materials. We select each one in turn and edit them as we want with the properties that we want, but also now we've got similarly where we have our options to add textures to our material or images to our material. We can do the same thing now. We click on the little plus sign and it brings this pop-up up. And so this is now an asset manager of sorts. So what you can do with this, so I'm still trying to figure all of this out myself, but what you can do with this is essentially load in an image. Let's just load in that blue one. Oh, that's TGA. I have to do that again, so we need a PNG. So it loads in the image, but it also adds it to the project, and it does it in a way that means that it can be assigned to other materials without necessarily interfering with similar references. So in the old creator, those of you that have TGA, it does import them, but there's it looks like there's a bug or an issue there. It does bring them in and does convert them, but it's a bit iffy. So one of the things that you may have found when you import certain products is that, and particularly products with a couple of meshes. So let's say for the sake of argument, the belt was a separate section mesh from the shorts, and you change the texture on one of them, it automatically changes the texture on the other because the materials haven't been properly separated out. So that would be a problem in the current editor, but in Studio we can apparently do the same thing, but it won't assign that same image in the same way it does in Legacy Client. So you wouldn't have the same texture applied to both meshes. So it looks like the asset, well, it looks like the way that Studio is dealing with texture assets particularly, it looks like it's an asset manager of sorts, or an asset browser. So once you've loaded an image into a project, you can then assign that image to different materials that may not have actually been associated with that particular image originally. I mean, I've not actually fiddled around with this too much, but it doesn't do it. How did you do it? There was a way to do it, but I can't remember what it is. That's really weird. It was doing it before, it's not doing it now. But so that's basically what IMVU Studio is doing with image assets. It's treating them more like they're a part or a component within an asset manager. So that, in theory, should make larger projects easier to work with, because you can apply the same image to multiple materials, even though they may not have originally been associated with that material. What else? So the same thing with meshes. And there is a way to edit these, but I can't remember what it is. So as you can see, there's going to be a lot of relearning a lot of stuff, rejigging the muscle memory in terms of trying to figure out where everything is. I mean, it's laid out relatively logically, but you know, long-time users are going to have a hard time just because it's a different tool. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's any better or worse than the current tool. It's just different. And then actions. Yeah, it's new ensembles. So I've not yet played around with a lot of this stuff because this is so new. I mean, it's only been out publicly about a week, I think. But yeah, so that's the basic breakdown of a project from the point of view of editing it. So we've got our components which correspond to the tabs. On the left, to edit a product, to edit an element or a component, we select it on the left and edit its details on the right. We can click on the Assets tab, and that corresponds to the Assets tab, which would list obviously all the assets that are involved with the project. So component is I'm not quite sure what component would correlate to, unless that would just be an asset thing as well. Whoops. But then our inventory, when we want to add something to the scene, that's now a tab. We've got error and info. So inventory, now there was a way of doing this. Oh, there we go, that's it. That's not quite as clear as it should be. I'm not quite sure why that's even there. So they're going with a if you use Photoshop, I guess this layout would be familiar if you were using Photoshop or if you're used to Photoshop, because it's these look like Dockers, these panels. So if you're used to that, then this might be more familiar. Because it's not familiar, it's not necessarily intuitive that clicking this filters all is supposed to bring up this filter dialog with a smart filter. So obviously we've got the option to filter all our products or the stuff that's in use. Yeah, so there's it's still a bit but anyway, this allows you to, oh, okay. So that's how you would add a project, another product to the scene. So you have to open the filter dialog. That could be clearer. Select what option you want, whether you're filtering all the products that you've got in your inventory, or whether you're trying to filter something specific. Yeah, what's that done? That was weird. Should be able to add furniture items without it. Okay, so that's a bit weird. So obviously with the old client, you just click on and add your product to the scene, but the avatar disappears when we select furniture. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. Oh, so these are toggleable. Can we select multiples? Nope. Just the one. Weird. Okay. So I'm not quite sure how. Not quite sure how much easier that would be than just the older system, because that's not necessarily as intuitive as you would expect it to be. Maybe these two buttons should be up here somewhere. And then when you click all, something else happens. Don't know. Error doesn't work at the moment, and that's debug, I think. Not sure exactly what error is. It could be an asset warning. So when you've imported a project and it's got unused assets, they'll be highlighted red and you can just remove them. So I don't know whether that's what's going to be under error. Or it might be debug information. And then we've got info, which is just all the product info that you would use before you submit. So you're saving your project as a complete unit rather than saving the mesh and texture info, submitting the product, and then adding in all your product information. So it looks like we can save that with the actual project. So it'll all come in whenever the project is loaded locally. So it means that we don't have to keep going through that submission process. So when you, oh, can't do it with this. Let's click that. So we don't have to keep going through this when we submit a project or a product. So it's keeping it all inside the project in the editor, which is good. But so I don't know how useful a breakdown this is, because it's all still very new and haven't really used this that much. So what we've got then, just do a quick recap. So we've got the components on the left, which are the main elements of our project. So that's the meshes, textures, animations. Whether that will include things like, so that's your animation files, so that's the XAF files, but there's also the possibility of maybe particle effects. So we're not quite sure yet what IMVU is going to do with particle effects, if they're going to be included, because if they are, it's going to be interesting to see whether they are backward compatible with the particle system that was, or that is currently hackable in the old client. So we have to wait and see on that. So we have our components on the left, and then the properties for each component on the right, which we can then edit. We've still got our preview buttons, save and submit, but the save as, I did note this, save as is now on the left. File and then save as. Right, so let's look at two things. The opacity map. So they might have changed this in the interim. Opacity test. Let me just blending mode comes in, no blending. Yeah, so the way that Studio and going forward next, the engine that this sits on top of, handles transparency and opacity maps in a slightly different way. Let me see if I can. Right. So in the old client, we have the ability to use well, basically it treats the transparencies in a slightly different way. I don't know if this is going to be possible in Studio and in Next going forward. I'm not quite sure how transparency is being handled, because Studio seems to handle transparency, particularly the more complex opacity maps. So if you imagine that this is something like a lace curtain or something with lace, so fine patterns on it, where you would need to use blending in order for the image to appear as you would expect it to, based on the pixels. So your black and white and shades of grey. Your black and white, shades of grey pixels in your opacity map define the severity of the transparency if you have use blending active. Right, so if that's disabled, what it does is it clips. So it does a sort of a binary interpretation of the transparency. It looks at a pixel, say the ones around the edge, and where they might be grey, it sets a threshold of I think it's something like 50%. So if the grey value is darker or lighter than 50% black and white, so you're talking mid-greys, so 50% grey. So if it were a 60 or 70% grey, with this disabled, it clips it rather than displaying it as a transparency or a value of a degree of transparency. So it'll clip it, and that results in this hard mask. Basically, so it becomes a mask rather than an opacity map per se, and that is what Studio does by default. So if we don't have, it's not composite, it's just the alpha threshold stuff. So we have to enable alpha threshold, which is the value, the default value that's used to clip. Can't really get any closer to, oh, there we go. So we can see that that clips it quite hard, and we have a hard edge. So that's basically because the grey value that's used to define that edge is lighter or darker than the threshold that is set by default for this. But in Studio we have more control over that threshold value, and it's called the alpha threshold. So with that enabled, let's set that to 0. Preview. Keep zooming out. What we end up with is a very hard clip, which results in this stepping or aliasing. The approximate value that desktop uses is 50. So if we enable that, we get something that's starting to resemble, although it's still quite aggressive. Whoops. So that's quite a, so what's the threshold on that then? 75. Nope. No, so that's different as well. So this is going to take some getting used to. I don't know what's going to happen with this, because I can't imagine, you know, all the lacy clothing makers that use a lot of lace patterns. I don't know how that's going to work. because it doesn't appear as though Studio currently, in its current form, again remember it's a beta, I don't know how. Let's disable that. Oh no, we need that because we've got an animated texture. I don't know how alpha transparency is going to be handled by default, because with it disabled, I don't think composite does anything. Oh yes, it does. Oh, there we go. So it's a composite thing. Okay, so we've got two. So it is doing it then. Oh, well, that's good. Wasn't quite sure about that. Right, so that means then this is kind of confusing actually. So if we have use blending enabled, we get a similar looking transparency. So that's with, whoops, blending mode composite. So with Studio, it looks like we have more control. So if we disable that, so it looks like the alpha settings then give us more control over this type of transparency where we want clipped edges. But if we want the traditional looking transparency, we can use, we still have the use blending feature. So composite, so no blending. So we don't have any blending, which then shows the texture maps. Enable alpha threshold. Which now gives us greater control over use blending disabled in the old client. So they've separated those two functions out. Completely by the looks of things. Okay, so that's cool. That'll be useful. Yeah, that's useful because it means that we have greater control over the degree of, well, how aggressive how aggressive that is. That's a anti-aliasing. So disable that, enable blending composite. And that gives us what we're used to. Then disable composite, enable alpha threshold. that gives us the clipped blending, which is the off mode by default for Blender. Not Blender, IMVU Classic. Nice, okay. Well, next then is something that's quite interesting. Don't know how clearly this will come through, but with this client, with this new editing tool, we now have, or we can now use normal maps. That's these purpley things. But we've also got access to Shininess Texture. So in another stream, we'll go over making normal maps and Shininess maps. But basically what that does is it allows us to create visual depth with a normal map, and then we have the shininess of the Shininess map. So for products like now where is it? Okay, so we'll have to create a new one. So what we're going to do is create a project. So click create, male clothing, tops. Just going to derive from the empty male clothing. Derive. So we want to reset the avatar. Filter all. In use. How do we remove them? There we go. So we get a little minus. It would be good to be able to just reset them all at the same time instead of clicking through all of them. Right, so importing an Fbx file. File, edit, import. Avatar, Blender 2.8. So that's an Fbx file. We'll get this Fbx import dialog. Set up Fbx 0.01. Select the skeleton. We want 86 bones, 1 mesh. Mesh ID. It gives us a whole list of the basic defaults. So that's 1, 2, head, hair, chest. Yeah, so that's head, hair, upper, right, left, lower, left, right, and then foot. And then we've got all these arbitrary ones that we can use. So 46, next, shows us the textures or the material IDs, next, no animation, and preview, import. And then we have to click the preview button at the top. And that loads in the mesh. So what we can do with this now, component, so that's our material. We can select it, and then on the inspector, where's the texture information gone? It should be showing. Oh, there we go. Okay, so it's a bit buggy. So material. So we're going to add a normal map. So click on the icon, add image. Now I've got to find it. So I don't know if the TGA will work. Let's try it. Preview. Not sure if that's worked. Shininess, add image. Let's just try that. Preview. And it's taking its time because apparently oh, there we go. So it has done it. So that is now our shininess and normal map applied to the project. And it takes its time when you're previewing because it's sending the data back and forward to IMVU. Yeah, it's when it's in place, it's, you know, I mean, you can imagine the PVC people are going to go nuts with this. So all those creators that make all that PVC stuff, they'll just have a blast with this. So that's what normal maps and shininess maps can do to the products. So of course this begs the question as to whether these will be backward compatible with the old client, and the obvious answer to that is no. So it's not, I'm not sure what's going to happen. Everyone loves shiny things. Yeah, well, I mean, you can imagine jewelry, obviously PVC, but shiny stuff, glass, all sorts of stuff that this can be used with. But it does mean, and again we'll get to this in another stream, how to actually make normal maps and shininess maps and what you need to look out for when you're actually making them. Because if you do it wrong, it does look a bit naff. But that is shininess and normal maps. And you can see that, well, hopefully you can see that the normal map that's in place is actually making the shininess. So essentially there's a fold in the cloth here, and there's one on this side as well, and the shininess is on the highlight of that fold in the cloth. So the normal map is providing a sort of a pseudo structure, and the shininess map sits on top and reacts to the lighting based on obviously the orientation the light is to the object. I think it's in the front, so we're standing essentially in front of the light, but you can see that it makes the object look much more three-dimensional. So a quick word about the import process. This was with an Fbx, obviously. The IMVU may very well be focusing on the Fbx asset pathway. Yes, it does. So shininess does depend on the room you're in. So both of them actually, normal map and shininess, react to the lighting, or they will be reacting to the lighting from what I understand. So if you load into a different room with different lighting and coloured lighting, your shininess and your bump map, well, the bump map won't change, but the shininess will. It'll change relative to the scene and the colour of the lighting that's in the room. Yes, there's a lot of stuff that you can do with it, but with the Fbx stuff, as far as I know, because of doing all the stuff for the Education Centre with the Fbx tutorials, IMVU want to focus on Fbx, but they are, as far as I'm aware, still accommodating, that's the word, they're still accommodating the older Cal3D files, because an Fbx is just a container for the data that IMVU needs to convert into the necessarily Cal3D components. So although we used an Fbx file to get this into IMVU Studio, the actual data that's used is Cal3D, because the process converts it from an Fbx into the necessary Cal3D XML files. So if you look at the Assets tab, so it's brought it in as an Fbx, but the actual data is broken down into the traditional components that we're used to. So XMF, XSF, RF, AF, PF. But Fbx is just pretty straightforward to import. And that's what you can do with shininess maps and normal maps. So it'll be interesting to see what creators do with these. And apparently, so this won't be compatible with the old desktop client. It'll only work in the next engine. So not sure what's going to happen with, if you make products with Studio and publish them, I'm not sure whether that means that they will then only be available to IMVU Desktop, the new client, or the old legacy thing, you know, the thing that we're used to, this. So it may very well be that IMVU feel that at some point they have to add another texture slot here that accommodates the traditional texture images, because you can imagine that without a normal map and a shininess map, that these products may look a little flat. So that's IMVU Studio. Obviously, as I say, it's still in beta, so there's still a lot that needs to be done. But products can be made with it and can be published. But I don't know where they will be visible. So that's the same thing. So we've got a normal map that defines the brick, and then the shininess map that defines the text that's on there, which doesn't actually exist. That's just pure shininess. And that's reacting to the scene light. So again, depending on the room that this is in, the shininess effect will change. The same way with the top. But yes, so there was one thing that's important to know. When you save your projects in IMVU Studio, they are, if you save them, they're saved locally. So save and save as. But the previewing aspect of it, so when we click on apply changes, so let's just change a setting, and then we click on apply changes, it's instant, because all of this is happening in client, so it's in the actual software itself. With Studio, this is different now. So whenever you make a change and click preview, I'm not sure whether it's sending the assets to IMVU, but essentially there's a communication between your PC and IMVU HQ, and that delay, there's going to be a delay there somewhere. You know, whether that's because I don't know if it's sending the actual assets or just the properties, and they're doing this for asset security, I think. So there are going to be delays between making changes to various settings. So let's just enable Vertex Colors, if it'll do it. Well, let me do it now. Why isn't it letting me do it? Dagnabbit. Okay, let's try double-sided then. Okay, double-sided. No blending. So we've got those two settings changed. Preview. So it's not done it instantly. Now it's changed it. It may be both asset security, as in theft, and or to monitor what people are doing in Create, as in usage data, as opposed to, you know, spying on what you're doing. I would imagine that security does kind of imply monitoring to a certain degree in terms of what people are doing, so that, for example, if you think of the extended creator reports, where you can go into the report and check or search for products that are duplicates of yours that have not been derived from properly, so basically stolen meshes. So I would imagine that to get a better handle on that kind of thing and theft in general, they're switching to focusing on everything being authenticated, I suppose is the better word. So it's an authentication process, I guess, is probably the best way of thinking of it. So it's not necessarily monitoring it wouldn't necessarily be monitoring creators for the sake of just monitoring to make sure that, you know, they're not doing something. It's monitoring them from the point of view of the security of the system to make sure that the assets are properly I can't think of the word. So the hierarchy is properly established when a product is derived from. But this is, so there'll be interesting questions about how that then means what happens with, well, what happens with things like the extended creator reports. Does this then mean that we'll have more accurate reports and that we're better able to deal with stolen meshes or, you know, theft or just that kind of stuff, generally speaking? But it means that for some projects, I mean, you can imagine doing a big room with 50 or 60 textures, depending on what it is that's being changed in the asset's properties. You know, once you click the preview button, it may take a while for the preview to update if it's somehow physically transferring the updated assets, because it kind of has to. Because if you update the texture and the preview is being confirmed at IMVU HQ, then is it sending the updated assets to HQ to be uploaded there so that they can be authenticated and then approved, you know, from a machine point of view, from the program's point of view, which then means that there's going to be a delay. Yeah, there's nothing else. There's nothing else really other than those. The main changes are, I mean, aside from the fact that it's just a new application, but the main changes are the way that they deal with opacity. So we now essentially have that more or less delineated between the blending versus clipping. So this is clipped versus the blending, and the addition of normal maps and shininess maps. So those are the two really big changes, and they'll take a bit of getting used to. But everything else that we're used to does appear to be there. And apparently the is it not debug tools, asset tools, you can still, or we may still be able to edit the internal workings of projects in order to do things like scalars. But I'm not sure where that may be. So that's IMVU Studio. That was a bit clunky because it's all still very new. So looking at that was a bit clunky and a bit haphazard. But if I'll drop the links. I'll drop the links in again. So that's the forum section. And this is where you download it. Yes, it looks good. It's definitely going to be interesting to see what's going to happen going forward. Because does it mean if you can't use these products with the shininess and the normal maps, you can't really... Can we remove unassign asset? Unassign asset. Come on, wakey wakey. There we go. To be effective with a normal map and shininess map, you can't really use the maps that we've been using because they are painted for a particular purpose. So we tend to paint our highlights and shadows into our textures. If you do that with normal maps, and if you do that with the intent to then use normal maps and shininess maps, it makes the product look a little odd. But this is obviously compatible with the legacy client, but normal maps and shininess maps aren't. And the diffuse map that you would have to make to utilize the normal map and the shininess map is not going to look right in the legacy client. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens from this point on, whether IMVU do add another slot in here for legacy purposes, because it essentially would then mean that there are two catalogs basically. So there'll be a catalog of products that utilize normal map and shininess map. Come on, preview button. There we go. Does it then mean that the catalog is going to be split into two types of products? So products with the normal maps and the shininess maps versus the traditional products. So it'll definitely be interesting to see what happens when this becomes a little more mainstream from a development point of view. So, yeah, that is IMVU Studio Beta. So it's worth downloading and having a look at it, actually, and just playing around with it to get used to how it functions, because this is what we will be using in the future. I don't know if a legacy editor is going to be pulled. I doubt it, because obviously there are nearly 50 million products in the catalogue that, you know, what's the backward compatibility of Studio versus the editor. So it'll be interesting to see. But yeah, so did I do one with animation? No. No, I didn't do one with animation. That's still a bit, that still needs to be worked on. But we can get clothing items, basic furniture, basic rooms, although I've yet to test rooms. Clothing, furniture, accessories, those could be brought in. So anything to do with the avatar's appearance, we can make products for using Studio, and so it's worth just downloading and taking a look and seeing what you can, seeing if you can break it. And if you find any bugs or suggestions, feature suggestions, it's worth dropping those in the forum section that was just linked in chat. So yeah, that's IMVU Studio Beta. So I'm still pretty much nonplussed by it as well, so still trying to work my way around it. But in the next stream, what we'll do is we'll take a look at making normal maps. That's these bluey purpley things. We'll take a look at making normal maps, the basics of it, just nothing complicated. Take a look at making normal maps and the shininess maps, and some of the things that you want to be looking out for when you are making them because of how they work. So in the next stream we'll take a look at that, and then just do something maybe simple and make a normal map and shininess map on something simple, a simple object, so that we can see the process fully, or as properly as can be. Right, well, we've been going for an hour and a half, 40 minutes. So we'll call it quits there. But if you have any questions, do ask them on the forums. You can get in touch on social media with me in particular. But that's it. That'll be it for today. So the next one, yes, we'll go over normal maps and shininess maps. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with this. Right. Phew, that's quite a lot of info to take on board, because it is quite a change to what we've been used to. But I guess the whole idea behind it really is because Studio, I don't know if this will ask me to sign in. Yes, it will. But basically, Studio and IMVU Desktop both use the same rendering engine. And the change to desktop, whoops, where's all my stuff gone? The change to desktop has been forced in a sense because of the issues with Mac OS no longer supporting 32-bit. So next, the engine that's, well, it's actually called North Star, but next runs on North Star. So because they've had to upgrade the desktop app for iOS and Mac OS, it's given them the impetus to update the client tools, the Studio tools. So that's what Studio runs on. So again, it's not clear what's going to happen from the point of view of the legacy software, the legacy apps, once all of this stuff goes fully live. But I suspect that they'll keep the same, they'll keep the apps live for as long as possible and just run these two new apps concurrently with the older legacy tools. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens from this point on. Right, we should call it quits there, and next stream we'll look at null maps and shininess maps. So thanks for lurking, lurkers, and thanks for chatting in chat, Gaff. And we'll see you on the next stream. So bye for now, everyone.